May 8, 1943, 347 hours, communications bunker, Tunis, Tunisia. The air inside the concrete bunker is thick with cigarette smoke and the acrid smell of overheated vacuum tubes. Oberleutnant Klaus Hoffmann sits before the Enigma machine, his fingers poised above the keys, waiting for confirmation that never comes. Outside, the Mediterranean night carries the distant rumble of Allied artillery, closer tonight than it was yesterday, closer than it should be. The encryption device before him is a marvel of German engineering, a mechanical brain of rotors and wiring that has kept Wehrmacht communications secure for 3 years of war. He types the evening's authentication sequence, watches the lampboard illuminate its seemingly random pattern of letters, and transmits. Then he waits for the response from Oberkommando headquarters that will confirm the secure circuit remains intact. The response, when it arrives, is not in code. It is plain German text transmitted in the clear, and it contains a single devastating sentence. Discontinue all Enigma traffic immediately. Network compromised. Await further instructions. Hoffmann stares at the message strip as if the paper itself might be enemy deception. His hand trembles slightly as he reaches for the decryption logbook, flipping back through weeks of traffic, hundreds of messages sent and received with absolute confidence in their security. Every division movement, every supply convoy route, every tactical plan, every strength report, all transmitted in cipher that German cryptographers had assured them was unbreakable. The mathematics were sound, they said. The number of possible rotor positions exceeded astronomical figures. Even if the British captured a machine, they could never deduce the daily key settings in time for the intelligence to matter. But someone had broken it. Someone had been reading their mail for weeks, perhaps months. And Hoffmann, sitting in his smoke-filled bunker as the Allied armies closed in on the last German positions in North Africa, understands with sudden cold clarity that the encryption device before him is not a shield but a beacon. Every message he has sent has been a gift to the enemy. Every operational plan transmitted in good faith has arrived in British and American command posts hours later, decoded and analysed and converted into tactical advantage. He reaches for the telephone to wake his commanding officer, but his hand hovers over the receiver. What is there to say? That the entire architecture of German military communications has been compromised, that 3 years of signals traffic may have been transparent to Allied intelligence, that every tactical surprise, every carefully planned offensive, every defensive position may have been known to the enemy before the orders reached German field commanders. The Enigma machine sits before him, its rotors frozen in their current position, suddenly transformed from technological triumph to obsolete liability. In the weak light of the bunker's single bulb, Hoffmann sees his reflection in the machine's polished casing. A ghost looking back at him, the face of a man who has just learned that his entire professional purpose has been rendered meaningless by an enemy he never saw, and a defeat he never imagined possible. This is the moment when invincibility dies. Not in combat, not with the thunder of artillery or the scream of dive bombers, but in silence, in the sudden knowledge that the war has been lost in ways that soldiers cannot see or fight against. To understand the magnitude of what Hoffmann confronted that May night in Tunisia, one must first appreciate what Enigma represented to the German military imagination. The machine was not merely a communications tool. It was the technological embodiment of German intellectual superiority, a device so ingenious that its very existence seemed to confirm Nazi ideology about Aryan scientific advancement. Developed in the 1920s for commercial use and adopted by the Wehrmacht in the early 1930s, the Enigma machine employed a system of rotating wheels, or rotors, that scrambled plain text into seemingly impenetrable cipher. Each rotor could be set in 26 positions, corresponding to letters of the alphabet. Multiple rotors working in sequence created astronomical numbers of possible encryption combinations. By German calculations, the number of possible settings exceeded 150 quintillion. This mathematical complexity created what cryptographers call security through obscurity at scale. Even if an enemy knew exactly how the machine worked, and the Germans assumed the Allies had captured examples, the sheer number of possible daily key settings meant that brute force decryption would require computational resources beyond anything available in the 1940s, or so German cryptographers believed. They had built a system based on sound mathematical principles, had tested it against their own codebreakers, had refined it repeatedly. The confidence in Enigma's security was not arrogance but professional assessment based on the best cryptographic knowledge available. That confidence permeated every level of German military communications. Unlike more sensitive intelligence that might be transmitted via courier or landline, Enigma traffic moved freely over radio networks. Commanders sent detailed operational orders, logistics officers transmitted supply manifests, intelligence sections reported enemy dispositions, all encrypted by Enigma, all radioed through the air where anyone could intercept the signals. The assumption of security was so complete that communications discipline sometimes grew lax. Messages that should have been brief and cryptic became detailed and explicit because officers believed the encryption made content irrelevant to enemy ears. This assumption was murderously wrong. The story of how Enigma was broken is itself a saga of intellectual warfare, a contest between German engineering and Allied mathematics that played out in silence, far from battlefields. The breakthrough began not with American codebreakers but with Polish mathematicians who, in the years before the war, had obtained information about early Enigma machines and developed theoretical approaches to decryption. When Poland fell in 1939, Polish cryptographers fled to France and eventually to Britain, bringing their knowledge to the British code-breaking centre at Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion in Buckinghamshire that became the unlikely headquarters of the most successful intelligence operation in history. At Bletchley Park, a collection of mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, and crossword puzzle experts were assembled under conditions of absolute secrecy to attack German codes. The team included Alan Turing, a brilliant and eccentric mathematician whose theoretical work on computing would later revolutionize computer science. Turing and his colleagues approached Enigma not as a mechanical device to be replicated, but as a mathematical problem to be solved. They built electromechanical computers called bombs, not explosives, but computational machines designed to test thousands of possible Enigma settings in hours rather than years. The breakthrough came through a combination of mathematical genius and German operational mistakes. Enigma's security depended on perfect implementation. Operators had to follow strict procedures, key settings had to be truly random, messages had to avoid predictable patterns, but humans are not perfect. German operators developed habits, shortcuts, patterns. Some began messages with predictable phrases. Weather reports often started with Wetter, weather in German. Some operators, perhaps bored or lazy, chose non-random key settings, AAA or sequential letters. Some messages were transmitted multiple times with different key settings, giving codebreakers multiple versions of the same plain text to analyze. These small human imperfections became cracks in the mathematical armor. Bletchley Park cryptographers exploited these patterns, using them as entry points into the day's key settings. Once a single message was broken, that day's settings were known, and all traffic using those settings became readable. The bombs accelerated this process, mechanically testing possible rotor positions until they found settings that converted the intercepted cipher text into coherent German. It was not magic but mathematics, not luck but systematic analysis of probability and pattern. By 1941, Bletchley Park was regularly reading German Enigma traffic, though not all of it. The German Navy used more complex Enigma variants with additional rotors that resisted decryption longer. But Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe traffic was increasingly transparent. The intelligence derived from these decrypts was given the codename Ultra, and it was treated with security measures more stringent than any military secret in the war. Churchill himself restricted Ultra distribution to a handful of senior commanders. Operational orders derived from Ultra intelligence were disguised as coming from conventional sources: aerial reconnaissance, captured documents, prisoner interrogations. The Allies sometimes allowed convoys to be attacked, or positions to be overrun rather than act on ultra-intelligence, in ways that might reveal they were reading German codes. This elaborate security theatre had a single purpose: prevent the Germans from discovering that Enigma was compromised. If the Germans suspected their codes were broken, they would change encryption systems, and the intelligence would vanish. So Ultra was protected not just as a secret, but as a capability that had to be preserved at almost any cost. For officers like Klaus Hoffmann, the truth about Enigma's vulnerability emerged gradually and then all at once. Throughout 1942 and early 1943, There had been disquieting patterns in Allied behaviour. British forces seemed to anticipate German movements with uncanny frequency. Convoys changed routes just before U-boats arrived at their projected positions. Allied bombers struck supply depots and rail yards hours after their locations were transmitted to higher command. Defensive positions came under artillery bombardment before German forces could fully occupy them. Each incident could be explained individually: aerial reconnaissance, local informants, random chance. But the pattern accumulated, and in the minds of some signals officers, suspicion began to crystallize. Hoffmann himself had dismissed such concerns when subordinates raised them. The mathematics were clear, he told them. Enigma could not be broken without astronomical computational resources. The British might capture isolated messages through direction finding or traffic analysis, deducing information from the volume and pattern of transmissions without breaking the content, but they could not be reading the actual text. To believe otherwise was to surrender to paranoia, to give the enemy credit for capabilities they did not possess. The North African campaign made such denial impossible to maintain. German and Italian forces, once masters of mobile desert warfare, found themselves consistently outmaneuvered by British and American armies. Rommel's brilliant tactical instincts seemed neutralized by opponents who anticipated his moves. Supply convoys crossing the Mediterranean were intercepted with devastating regularity. The Luftwaffe planned raids only to find Allied fighters waiting at altitude over target areas. By early 1943, as Axis forces contracted into a defensive perimeter around Tunis and Bizerte, even the most optimistic officers could see that something beyond conventional intelligence was undermining German operations. The official acknowledgement came through irregular channels. A signals officer from Oberkommando, flown into Tunisia in April 1943, had called a classified briefing for senior communications personnel. Hoffmann had attended, expecting discussion of new encryption procedures or radio equipment. Instead, the briefing officer had spoken in carefully neutral terms about communications security reassessment. The Enigma system, he explained, was being withdrawn from forward operational use, not because it was compromised, but because newer systems offered enhanced security. The framing was bureaucratic, face-saving, but the implications were clear to anyone listening carefully. The machine they had trusted for 3 years was no longer considered secure. Hoffmann had wanted to ask direct questions. Had the British broken Enigma, and if so, how much traffic had been read? But military culture and the officer's deliberately vague presentation discouraged such directness. The meeting ended with instructions to transition to one-time pad systems for critical communications and to limit radio traffic in general. No admission was made that years of German signals intelligence might have been an open book to Allied codebreakers. The order to cease all Enigma traffic, received that May night in the bunker, was the final confirmation. There was no longer any pretense of routine equipment upgrade or enhanced security procedure. The network was compromised, the damage already done, the only remaining question being how catastrophic the intelligence loss had been. The emotional impact of this revelation was unlike anything Hoffmann had experienced in 3 years of war. Combat losses were comprehensible. Soldiers fought, some died, positions were won or lost based on tactics and firepower and sometimes luck. Even defeat could be understood within a framework of military cause and effect. But this was different. This was the discovery that the very tools they had relied upon for secure communication had been weapons in enemy hands. Every message transmitted in good faith had been a betrayal. Every operational plan shared through encrypted channels had potentially reached Allied intelligence before reaching its intended German recipient. The psychological dimension was profound. Hoffmann and his fellow signals officers had prided themselves on technical competence, on mastering complex encryption procedures, on maintaining communications discipline. They saw themselves as the intellectual elite of the Wehrmacht, not frontline soldiers, but specialists whose expertise enabled military operations. The Enigma machine was the symbol of that expertise, the mechanical proof that German engineering and cryptographic science were superior to anything the Allies possessed. Now that symbol was revealed as liability. The expertise was hollow, the confidence was misplaced, and the intellectual superiority that Nazi ideology constantly proclaimed had been defeated not by brute force, but by better mathematics, better analysis, better systems. The British and Americans had not smashed the Enigma through military power. They had unravelled it through patient, intellectual work through teams of civilian mathematicians and linguists who approached the problem with systematic rigour and collaborative effort. This cognitive dissonance was difficult to process. German military culture emphasised discipline, order, technical mastery, all qualities that the Wehrmacht possessed in abundance. But the Allies had demonstrated a different kind of mastery, one based not on hierarchical precision, but on creative problem-solving, not on following established doctrine, but on thinking laterally about mathematical vulnerabilities. The Codebreakers at Bletchley Park were not warriors in any conventional sense. Many were academics, some were women, a few were eccentrics like Turing who barely fit into military culture. Yet these unlikely combatants had achieved a victory more strategically significant than most battlefield triumphs. The historical evidence for Enigma's impact on the war is now overwhelming, though it remained classified for decades after 1945. Historians studying the North African campaign have calculated that ultra-intelligence allowed Allied commanders to read between 75 and 90% of German operational traffic by mid-1943. Montgomery's victory at El Alamein in late 1942 was significantly aided by detailed knowledge of Rommel's fuel shortages and supply difficulties, information derived from Enigma decrypts. The Battle of the Atlantic turned decisively in the Allies' favour in mid-1943, partly because naval Enigma was finally broken, allowing convoy routes to be adjusted to avoid U-boat concentrations and enabling hunter-killer groups to be directed to submarine positions. The broader strategic impact is even more striking. Allied planners preparing for the invasion of Sicily and Italy had comprehensive intelligence on German defensive positions, unit strengths, and command structures, all derived primarily from Enigma. The Normandy invasion planning benefited from months of Enigma traffic, revealing German force dispositions across France and the Wehrmacht's organisational response to Allied deception operations. Some historians have estimated that ultra-intelligence shortened the war in Europe by 1 to 2 years, saving hundreds of thousands of lives, though this counterfactual is inherently unprovable. What is provable is the asymmetric advantage that signals intelligence provided. The Germans fought the war partially blind to Allied intentions, while the Allies read German plans in near real time. This was not total omniscience. Some German communications used more secure systems, and Enigma intelligence had to be interpreted and acted upon effectively. But the intelligence advantage was enormous, and it compounded over time. Allied commanders grew increasingly confident in their operational planning because they knew German capabilities and intentions. German commanders grew increasingly frustrated by an enemy that seemed always one step ahead. The symbolic object that recurs throughout. Accounts of German signals intelligence collapse is not the Enigma machine itself, but something more mundane and more telling, the one-time pad. A one-time pad is a cryptographic system of perfect security, a random key used only once to encrypt a single message. Breaking it is mathematically impossible without the key, because any plain text of equal length could theoretically produce the same ciphertext with some key. It is absolutely secure but operationally cumbersome. Each pad can encrypt only one message of its length, then must be destroyed. Distributing new pads requires physical transport, couriers, not radio. The system is slow, limited in capacity, and requires extensive logistical support. The German military had always possessed one-time pad systems for the most sensitive communications, orders from Hitler himself, high-level diplomatic traffic, specific intelligence reports. But the bulk of operational communications used Enigma because one-time pads could not support the volume and speed that modern mobile warfare required. Armies manoeuvring across continents, air forces coordinating raids across hundreds of miles, naval vessels operating in distant oceans, all needed rapid, flexible communications. Enigma provided that capability with what Germans believed was sufficient security. When Enigma was compromised, the German military faced an impossible choice: revert to one-time pads and accept crippling limitations on communication speed and volume, or continue using radio communications with the knowledge that the enemy might be listening. In practice, they did both, creating a hybrid system where critical orders used one-time pads or courier, while routine traffic continued via less secure methods. But this halfway measure satisfied no one. Operations slowed as commanders waited for couriers to arrive with authentic orders. tactical flexibility suffered as radio silence became the default. The Wehrmacht's advantage in mobile warfare, their ability to coordinate complex maneuvers through modern communications, was partially self-negated by the need to limit radio transmissions. Meanwhile, Allied forces operated with confidence in their own communication security. American and British encryption systems, particularly the Sagaba cipher machine used by US forces, proved resistant to German code-breaking efforts throughout the war. The Germans never achieved against Allied codes what the Allies achieved against Enigma. This asymmetry meant that Allied commanders could communicate freely, coordinating complex operations across multiple services and nations, while German commanders operated in partial silence, never sure whether their transmissions were being read. The contrast embodied a deeper difference in approach to military communications. German cryptography had relied on mechanical complexity, the intricate rotor system of Enigma that generated seemingly infinite encryption possibilities. But mechanical complexity, alone the Allies proved, was insufficient. The British and Americans developed not just cipher machines, but entire systems of signals intelligence, interception networks, cryptographic analysis, translation teams, intelligence integration procedures. They treated communication security and signals intelligence as interconnected problems requiring institutional solutions, not just clever engineering. This systematic approach reflected broader characteristics of how the Allies prosecuted the war, where Germany relied on the technical excellence of individual systems, whether the Enigma machine, the Tiger tank, or the Me-262 jet fighter. The Allies built integrated systems where components worked together. Bletchley Park was not just a collection of smart people with computing machines. It was an institution with recruitment procedures, training programs, career paths, internal communication protocols, and most critically, direct links to military commanders who could act on the intelligence. Ultra-intelligence was valuable not because it existed, but because it was efficiently distributed to commanders who could use it and who understood its limitations and sensitivity. Hoffmann's personal transformation mirrored the larger German military experience. He had entered the war as a technically trained professional, confident in his expertise and in the technological superiority that Nazi propaganda proclaimed. The Enigma machine was the physical manifestation of that confidence, a German invention, mechanically sophisticated, mathematically sound. Operating it required training and discipline, qualities that German military culture prized. The work was unglamorous compared to frontline combat, but it was essential, and Hoffmann took professional pride in maintaining secure communications under difficult conditions. The discovery that this entire professional edifice was built on compromised foundations shattered that confidence. It was not that Hoffmann personally had made mistakes. He had followed procedures correctly, had maintained encryption discipline, had operated the equipment exactly as trained. But the procedures themselves, the equipment itself, the entire system had failed at a level beyond individual competence to prevent. The failure was structural, institutional, intellectual. In the weeks after that May night order to cease Enigma traffic, Hoffmann continued performing his duties with the one-time pad systems and reduced communications protocols. But the psychological impact lingered. He found himself questioning other assumptions. If the encryption system that German experts had proclaimed unbreakable was in fact broken, what other confident assessments might be wrong? The Luftwaffe's claims of air superiority, intelligence assessments of Allied industrial capacity, the Führer's assurances that secret weapons would turn the tide. These doubts were dangerous in Nazi Germany, where defeatism was a capital offence and maintaining morale required rigid adherence to official narratives. Hoffmann kept his questions private, but they gnawed at him. He noticed them in his fellow officers too, a growing cynicism, a tendency to discount official pronouncements, a fatalistic acceptance that the war was being lost for reasons beyond their control or understanding. The North African campaign ended in May 1943 with the surrender of all remaining Axis forces in Tunisia. Hoffmann was among the 250,000 German and Italian soldiers taken prisoner, the largest Axis capitulation to that point in the war. In POW camps, away from the immediate pressures of combat and propaganda, discussions among captured officers revealed the extent to which Enigma's compromise had become an open secret. Intelligence officers spoke of Allied interrogators who seemed to know details about German units and operations that could only have come from communications intercepts. Logistics officers recounted supply convoys that were attacked with suspiciously accurate timing. Commanders described Allied tactical responses that anticipated German maneuvers before they fully developed. None of this was definitive proof. The nature of intelligence is that it remains ambiguous, plausibly explained by multiple sources. But the pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. The Germans had fought the campaign with a fundamental handicap, one that courage and tactical skill could not overcome. The Allies had known their plans, their strengths, their weaknesses, their supply situations, their command conflicts. Not perfectly, not omnisciently, but consistently and accurately enough to nullify German tactical advantages. The broader implications extended far beyond North Africa. As the war continued through 1943 and 1944, ultra-intelligence proved decisive in numerous theatres. In the Battle of the Atlantic, the breaking of German naval Enigma variants allowed Allied convoy routing to avoid U-boat patrol lines and enabled anti-submarine forces to hunt German submarines with increasing effectiveness. By mid-1943, U-boat losses exceeded replacement capacity, and the threat to Atlantic supply lines, which had been critical in 1942, was effectively neutralized. German submariners continued fighting with extraordinary courage, but courage could not overcome the fundamental disadvantage of operating against an enemy who knew their positions and patrol patterns. On the Eastern Front, where German forces faced the Red Army in the largest and bloodiest theatre of the war, signals intelligence played a different but significant role. The Soviets developed their own signals intelligence capabilities and occasionally received selected ultra-intelligence from the British. More importantly, the diversion of German resources to defend against Allied bombing campaigns and to fight in Italy and later France meant that the Wehrmacht could never concentrate its full strength against the USSR. The two-front war that Germany faced after 1941 was winnable only if German forces possessed overwhelming tactical and operational advantages. Ultra-intelligence helped ensure they did not. The Normandy invasion in June 1944 represented perhaps the ultimate vindication of Allied signals intelligence. The deception operation known as Fortitude, designed to convince Germans that the invasion would occur at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, succeeded partly because Enigma decrypts revealed German assessments of Allied intentions. Allied planners could read German intelligence appreciations, see what deception measures were working, and adjust their plans accordingly. After the landings, ultra-intelligence provided detailed information on German reinforcement movements, allowing Allied air power to interdict supply lines and destroy bridges with devastating effectiveness. German commanders in Normandy fought blind, uncertain of Allied intentions and unable to communicate securely with each other or with headquarters. The documentary evidence accumulated after the war paints a picture of systematic intelligence dominance. Allied commanders, from Eisenhower to Montgomery to Patton, had access to German operational orders, often within hours of their transmission. They knew German unit locations, fuel states, ammunition supplies, morale assessments, command disputes. This did not make Allied victory inevitable. Battles still had to be fought, and German forces remained dangerous opponents. But it provided Allied commanders with a confidence in planning and execution that German commanders never possessed. Allied generals could take calculated risks because they knew German capabilities. German generals operated in uncertainty, never sure how much the enemy knew or anticipated. The full extent of Ultra was not revealed publicly until the 1970s, when the British government began declassifying Bletchley Park records. The revelation shocked historians and veterans alike. Many German officers who survived the war had suspected signals intelligence played a role in their defeat, but had no way to confirm it or assess its scope. When the documentation emerged, it reframed understanding of numerous battles and campaigns. Tactical decisions that seemed brilliant in their moment were revealed as informed by comprehensive intelligence. German defensive preparations that seemed paranoid or misdirected were shown to be reactions to real but misunderstood intelligence indicators. For officers like Hoffmann, who survived the war and lived into the era of historical revelation, the confirmation was both validating and bitter. They had been right to suspect that something beyond conventional military factors was undermining German operations. But the scope of the compromise was worse than they had imagined. Not just weeks or months of traffic had been read, but years. Not just tactical communications, but operational and strategic planning. The entire architecture of Wehrmacht communication security had been. transparent to Allied intelligence for most of the war. The epilogue to the Enigma story carries profound lessons about the nature of warfare in the modern age. The machine itself was not poorly designed. By the cryptographic standards of its era, it was sophisticated and, if used perfectly, quite secure. The failure was not primarily technical, but human and institutional. German operators made small mistakes that created mathematical vulnerabilities. German commanders overestimated the security their system provided and communicated with less caution than prudence required. German cryptographers failed to recognize or refused to acknowledge evidence that their system was compromised, in part because accepting that conclusion would require admitting that the enemy possessed capabilities that German ideology denied they could have. The Allied success was not simply about having smarter mathematicians, though Turing and his colleagues were indeed brilliant. It was about creating systems and institutions capable of exploiting technical opportunities. Bletchley Park worked because it brought together diverse talents: mathematicians, linguists, engineers, intelligence analysts, and gave them resources, autonomy, and direct connections to military decision-makers. The British government invested heavily in signals intelligence, despite competing demands on limited resources. Churchill personally protected Bletchley Park's funding and ensured its product reached commanders who needed it. This institutional approach reflected broader characteristics of democratic systems at war. The Allies, particularly Britain and the United States, proved willing to empower unconventional people and approaches when they showed results. Turing, a socially awkward academic with unorthodox views, would have struggled to find a place in the rigidly hierarchical Wehrmacht. At Bletchley Park, his brilliance was recognized and exploited. Women mathematicians and linguists worked alongside men in roles that German military culture would have considered inappropriate. The code-breaking effort was collaborative and non-hierarchical in ways that produced innovation, but would have seemed chaotic or undisciplined to German observers. The recurring symbol in post-war German accounts of signals intelligence failure is not equipment or technology, but something more abstract: certainty. German cryptographers and military commanders were certain that Enigma was secure because the mathematics seemed sound and because Nazi ideology required belief in German technical superiority. This certainty prevented them from seriously investigating anomalies or acknowledging evidence that contradicted their assumptions. When suspicions did arise, institutional pressure and ideological commitment to German supremacy made it difficult to pursue them rigorously. Allied codebreakers, by contrast, operated with productive uncertainty. They did not assume Enigma was breakable, but they did not assume it was unbreakable either. They tested approaches systematically, discarding what failed and building on what showed promise. When breakthroughs occurred, they did not declare victory, but continued refining methods and defending against German security improvements. The intellectual culture at Bletchley Park rewarded skepticism, creativity, and willingness to challenge assumptions, qualities less valued in authoritarian military systems, where deference to hierarchy was paramount. This epistemological difference between certainty rooted in ideology and pragmatism rooted in empirical testing may have been as significant as any technical advantage. The Allies won the intelligence war not because they possessed secret knowledge, but because they created systems for discovering what they did not know and acted on that knowledge effectively. They built institutions capable of learning and adapting. They protected intelligence sources with ruthless discipline while ensuring intelligence reached commanders who could use it. They integrated signals intelligence with other intelligence sources and operational planning in ways that multiplied its effectiveness. Klaus Hoffmann survived the war as a prisoner and eventually returned to Germany in 1947. He found a nation destroyed physically and psychologically, its cities in ruins, its population traumatized, its ideology utterly discredited. In the denazification process, his role as a signals officer was investigated but determined to be non-criminal. He had operated encryption equipment, not participated in war crimes. Like millions of Germans, he faced the challenge of rebuilding a life in a country that had to confront the moral catastrophe of the Nazi regime and the military catastrophe of total defeat. In later years, as details of Ultra emerged, Hoffmann participated in historical projects documenting Wehrmacht communications procedures. His interviews with historians reveal a man who had achieved a kind of rueful clarity about the war. He acknowledged the technical brilliance of the Allied code-breaking effort, while maintaining pride in his own professional competence within the limits of what he had known. He recognized that German defeat had been overdetermined, caused not by any single factor, but by multiple systemic disadvantages that compounded over time. Signals intelligence was one element among many: Allied industrial superiority, strategic bombing, the Soviet Union's ability to sustain catastrophic losses and continue fighting, Hitler's interference in military decisions, Germany's strategic overextension. But signals intelligence, Hoffmann came to believe, represented something deeper than a technical advantage. It represented a difference in how democratic and authoritarian systems prosecute modern war. The Allies created institutions, Bletchley Park, the Manhattan Project, the logistics networks that supplied forces across oceans, that empowered talented individuals, encouraged innovation, and adapted to feedback. Nazi Germany created hierarchical structures that demanded obedience, punished dissent, and enshrined ideological certainty above empirical reality. When facing complex challenges like cryptanalysis, industrial production, or coalition warfare, the Allied approach proved more effective. This was not a moral judgment about individual virtue. German soldiers and officers were not less brave or intelligent than their Allied counterparts. It was a structural observation about systems. Systems that encourage questioning and innovation respond more effectively to unforeseen challenges than systems that demand conformity and punish deviation from doctrine. Systems that value individual lives invest in protecting those individuals, which in turn preserves institutional knowledge and experience. Systems that integrate diverse perspectives and talents discover solutions that homogeneous cultures miss. The Enigma machine, sitting silent and useless in Hoffmann's bunker that May night in Tunisia, symbolized the failure of German ideology to comprehend these realities. It was a sophisticated device rendered obsolete not by superior German engineering being defeated, but by a different approach to problem-solving entirely. The machine had failed not because it was poorly made, but because the system surrounding it, the institutional culture, the operational assumptions, the ideological certainties, was inadequate to defend it against opponents who approached the challenge systematically and creatively. In the stillness of that communications bunker, with the sounds of Allied artillery growing closer and the order to cease Enigma transmissions burning in his hand, Klaus Hoffmann confronted a truth that would take decades to fully articulate. Modern warfare is won not primarily by courage or even by technology, but by systems, by institutions that can harness human intelligence, adapt to challenges, protect their advantages, and exploit enemy weaknesses. The Enigma machine was a tool, neither heroic nor villainous. But the systems built around it on both sides told different stories about how nations organized knowledge, power, and human effort. The Allied victory in the Signals Intelligence War was not inevitable. It required immense resources, brilliant individuals, institutional support, and operational security so tight that the secret remained hidden for 3 decades after the war. But it succeeded because democratic systems, for all their inefficiencies and contradictions, proved capable of mobilizing talent across social boundaries, empowering unconventional thinkers, and adapting to evidence rather than ideology. The German defeat in this silent war was not foreordained either, but it emerged from a system that prioritized certainty over inquiry, hierarchy over collaboration, ideological purity over empirical reality. The same characteristics that made the Wehrmacht a formidable fighting force in the war's early years, discipline, technical precision, aggressive confidence, became liabilities when facing opponents who fought with flexibility, systematic analysis, and institutional learning. On that May night in 1943, as Klaus Hoffmann prepared to destroy his encryption logbooks and transition to communication systems that would cripple German operational flexibility, the broader trajectory of the war was already written, not just in the tactical defeats accumulating across North Africa, but in the systemic advantages that Allied forces would carry through Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and ultimately into the heart of Germany itself. The silence that fell over German communications networks that night was not merely the absence of radio traffic, it was the sound of certainty collapsing, of assumptions failing, of a war being lost in ways that courage could not prevent and ideology could not explain. The lesson endures: Wars are won by those who learn, adapt, and systematically exploit advantages while protecting vulnerabilities. The Enigma machine could not be broken by force, but it was broken by thought. Patient, systematic, collaborative thought, organized within institutions that valued results over doctrine. In the contest between mechanical complexity and mathematical insight, between ideological certainty and empirical investigation, between hierarchical rigidity and creative flexibility, the latter proved decisive. The cipher broke, the network fell silent, and with it fell the last illusion that German technical superiority could overcome Allied systemic advantages. What remained was mathematics, cold and certain, and the inescapable conclusion that this war would be won not by warriors but by systems, not by honour but by effectiveness, not by certainty but by those who questioned everything, including and especially their own assumptions.